Welcome to Acton in Focus. I'm Vivian Kobusingye Birchall, your host. Today, I'm hosting a panel of legislators, local legislators, who are going to talk about Black history in our state, in our town. Welcome to the show, our legislators, and please introduce yourselves and tell us what your constituency is. Starting with, Representative Tami.
Sure. Thank you so much, Vivian, for having us here. I'm State Representative Tami Gouveia. I represent half of Acton and then parts of Chelmsford, as well as Carlisle and Concord.
I'm State Senator Jamie Eldridge. The district is the Middlesex and Worcester District, 14 communities, Acton, Boxborough, Harvard, Littleton, Ayr, Shirley, Westboro, Northborough, Southborough, Marlborough, Hudson, Stowe, Maynard, Sudbury.
Of course, I have Leo here, but I'm Representative Sena, representing the towns of Acton, Boxborough, Acton, Ayr, Harvard, Shirley, and Lunenburg.
Well, you're welcome to the show again. The state of Massachusetts was one of the first to end slavery by 1783, and long before the 13th Amendment formally banned it nationwide in 1865. But the state was also the first to legalize slavery in 1641. And according to historians and researchers, before 1641, merchants in Massachusetts Bay Colony had enslaved Native Americans, and by 1638, were battering them for Africans in the West Indies. So the slave trade grew from there and soon became a pillar of the colonial economy. My question to you, in what ways did Massachusetts' colonial economy influence legislation, and how did that legislation affect lives of Black people in the state as we know it? Starting with Representative Tami.
Great, thank you, Vivian, and thank you for providing some of the quick history on enslavement here in the state of Massachusetts, and also the ending of slavery before many of the other states. I think what I think about when I think about slavery and I think about our current economy, I think about the fact that our country built its wealth and became a superpower mostly because it did enslave, as you pointed out, Native Americans and also Africans. And without that exploitation early on, we wouldn't have continued to see the ongoing exploitation of workers that exist current day, that are supported both by our state laws, but also by federal laws. We don't have a living wage in our state. It's great that we have a $15 minimum wage push, but I would argue that is not, in fact, a living wage. So there are ways that tax policies, when you think about the tax rate on unearned versus earned income, that really benefits the wealthy and acknowledges, what the wealthy are able to gain in terms of tax infrastructure that does not benefit workers and the hard work that they do every single day to help generate wealth for wealthy corporations and individuals. So, we just sort of see this on and on also in terms of the decimation of a lot of unions and the strength that unions used to have. And we see a lot of policies that have been rolled back. And so I think a lot of that goes back to the early mindset around the fact that, well, it's okay to exploit people. It's okay to exploit workers because it's helping to generate wealth for individuals and thereby generate wealth for the country as a whole and created us as a superpower. So I think it's a really important question to think about that history and how it relates to current day.
Thank you, Representative Tami. Senator Jamie?
Oh, yes. First of all, I just want to echo what Representative Gouveia said is, absolutely clear connection to how Indigenous people and, the first Black residents of then the colonies of North America, were treated in a direct line to a lot of our policies now about, how we pay and treat, those workers that, right now during the pandemic, suddenly are gaining a bit of a greater appreciation, the essential workers in, nursing homes and hospitals and our grocery stores who are disproportionately Black and brown people. So I absolutely agree with that. And I think as far as the, sort of colonial economy and laws, which you pointed out that Massachusetts, while being the first state to ban slavery, was the first state to legalize it, and really an important reminder that slavery did happen here in Massachusetts. Obviously, among the first genocides of indigenous people were here in Massachusetts, including the King Philip's War, which did occur in this area, the Acton, Boxborough, Sudbury area, and that a lot of those policies set up the framework that when the colonies became the United States of America, they in many ways continued. And so we really need to look back to the beginning of the roots of our history, and especially obviously white colonists, and think about the impact in our history today and how that impacts Black residents in Massachusetts.
And thank you, Senator. Representative Sena?
You mentioned colonial period, and we talked about the plantation a little bit back then, right? When the workers were exploited, and we look at agricultural workers right now. How much rights do they have? And when we talk about the minimum wage, is that enough even to be able to rent an apartment with that? So those are dialogues that we are still facing it today. Those policies that were in effect centuries ago are still having an impact today, even when we try to update policies. So certainly, I think we need to look ways to diversify. Not only, look at how many CEOs of colleges do we have, right? I mean, those positions of power and influence, how many minorities are there? So that's really great to have this conversation. So thank you.
Thank you, Representative Sena. And my next question, after the end of the legal slavery period, racial segregation continued in Massachusetts, both as a legal requirement in various contexts until the mid-20th century, and as a de facto practice until present day in areas such as housing, education, name it. So as legislators, what is your experience and observation of the segregation trends against Blacks? And how does it manifest, and what legislation exists to put an end to the segregation in key areas, again, such as housing? I will start with Representative Gouveia.
Yeah, so I think your introduction to this question is really important, that there were policies put in place that forced segregation, particularly when it comes to housing policy and redlining policies that prohibited banks from being able to make loans to people of color, or to provide loans where people wanted to live in integrated communities. That was indeed in federal policy that trickled down to banking practices and to state practices and state policies as well. I think what has happened as a result too is that the ways that we have created educational policies where families, parents want to live in areas where they have the greatest educational opportunities for their children. But what that does is it drives up the cost of housing in those areas, making it impossible for many diverse populations, not just African Americans and Latinx people, but many different populations, from being able to live in a way that's integrated, because our structures have been built on those historical practices and those historical policies. And so it's taking the conversations that we're having now to really take a hard look at some of those policies. Some of them had been reversed, in the 1970s, but we're still lagging very far behind in terms of our culture, in terms of our mindsets and our practices. They've just been so ingrained, and there are just multiple policies, employment policies, transportation policies also, a push to make sure that transportation is reliable, accessible, and affordable to communities who live in different parts of the state is also a critical aspect of segregation, and why we live in ways where we're not as integrated as we really could be. And a lot of it, again, goes also back to tax policies and just what those conditions for opportunities are, similar to what Rep. Sena said just a few moments ago. So I look forward to working with colleagues in the state to, pass tax fairness policies, pass and really implement fully the Student Opportunity Act, so that we can make sure that educational opportunities are really created in all parts of our state, not just in the wealthy suburbs.
Thank you, Representative Gouveia. Senator Jamie?
Yeah, with respect to the continued segregation of people based on race or economics, I continue to very much focus on housing and zoning reform and our countries and our states lending policies. And I think it's really important to emphasize is that many of these policies, if you're talking about redlining, where entire neighborhoods, essentially the federal government prohibited lending to allow Black families to move into new housing or suburban communities, to just zoning is most housing, including most parts of Acton, 1 or 2 acre zoning, it's automatically going to have an impact where those that are not as well off, it's going to be harder for them to find housing. And I think that's why for the most part suburban communities look the way that they do, overwhelmingly white, and that these policies are not they're not from the 17th century, 18th century, 19th century. These are policies that many of which passed in the 1940s and 50s, that led to the segregation that we still have. One of my favorite books is Common Ground, talking about the desegregation of the Boston public schools. And I think one of the tragedies that is sort of highlighted in that book that I think sometimes people in the suburbs don't appreciate is the reason that there were so many battles in Boston over the segregation of Black students and white students in the schools is because suburban communities, the way they were zoned, the housing policies essentially prevented Black families from being able to move out to the suburbs. And so the suburbs, didn't do their part. And that's why now a real need to, certainly what I focused on is, how do we encourage denser housing, more multifamily housing, more affordable housing, so that a diversity of residents can live in every community, including in Acton. And that's something that we really haven't made a lot of progress at, and both the federal and state government and obviously local government can make a big difference in that.
Thank you, Senator Eldridge. Representative Sena?
Absolutely. I mean, the senator kind of really sum up some of the problems that we have right now, and how do we address, and it's not only in the housing sector that we see discrimination, right? Also when it comes to education. So it's like education, it opens the door and opportunity for many of those barriers that an individual would face when it comes to being able to afford a nice home, or it's public housing. Would public housing solve the problem? Expanding more public housing? Not necessarily, right? Because we want to make sure that people are able to provide for their families in a way that any other person can. And we see a lot of barriers for people of color and immigrants to achieve that dream, to achieve that goal. And how do we remove those barriers? It's an ongoing dialogue and discussion that we need to be having. When it comes to policies, for example, really want to make sure that the most impacted are benefiting from the state and federal government for the policies that we put in place. For example, SNAP benefits. Not a lot of people understand and knows the process that they even be able to qualify for SNAP and food assistance. So it's really getting that information out there to the public. And how do we do that? That's also another challenge that we face. Even as legislature, we pass a law. We need to educate the public. This is what your rights. This is what you can do to benefit from it. So it's certainly making sure that we are being very transparent when it comes to not only housing, but really all the legislation that we pass.
We've talked about housing, in different ways. And I worked for the land use department, and I used to attend public hearings. And one of the common phrases for people who didn't want certain types of housing for one reason or another, it was to preserve the character of the neighborhood. And that, what is, as legislators, what is this character of the neighborhood, and how does the law interpret that, and how has it become a thorn in affordable housing?
Really glad. Oh, go ahead. No,
I'm
you go
sorry.
ahead.
I'm sorry. I was, thanks for the question, Vivian, and the example I always think about, just because it's very specific in South Acton, is that when there was a discussion around a proposed 40B housing, there was a neighborhood association forum called the South Acton Neighborhood Association, Sena, and I remember looking at Sena's website, and it might still be up there, but it says, we love South Acton. It's a place of beautiful historical homes. Talking about some of the specific neighborhoods. There wasn't a single mention of the apartment buildings and the affordable housing that are in South Acton, including the Parker Street area in South Acton. So I mean, that's just one example where the focus, to your point about character, yes, we want to make sure that any new housing looks nice, but there's this suggestion that somehow density or affordable housing is out of character from the town, and I think that's often code words that's used to basically oppose affordable housing without having to upfront say it. And so we need to sort of call that out, and it's certainly my hope that groups like Racial Justice for Black Lives will sort of raise that up as they're raising up other terminology, is that the comment of the character of a community, or fears of density, that means there's just not going to be as much multifamily or affordable housing in a community.
Thank you.
Yeah, where I wanted to sort of take this conversation a little bit is, do people feel welcome in our town? Do people feel welcome in certain towns across the state? And I think that's really a difficult juncture where we are in having conversations about whether or not people do feel welcome here, because it's yes, policy is one lever to create shifts in culture and mindsets and practices, but it's not the only thing. It has to do with, how do the residents who are already here welcome and include people who come from a different state, a different country, a different cultural background, a different socioeconomic background. I would venture to guess that, in fact, most of the Black families in our town are middle income or upper income and don't have a need necessarily for affordable housing. And I think there's still some challenges that we have, regardless of what our housing policies are. Those are definitely, part of the solution, but I think there are other things that are sort of flowing underneath all of that are also important for us to be tackling in this town and across the state. And policy can't solve all of those things. It's sort of like when we were talking about police reform in the legislature last year, and I was having ongoing conversations with community residents, with members of the police department, and really just acknowledging that, we're not going to solve the issues of systemic racism and the treatment of Blacks at the hands of police officers if we don't also have the conversation about how average citizens are responding and picking up the phone to call the police on our Black and brown neighbors. And so that comes from community members. The police showing up at somebody's house is a tip of the iceberg, but if there are community members here who are calling the police, that's also part of the problem. And police reform is only going to take us that far in that conversation. So I do think there's, just an important conversation that we've been having for quite a while in this town. And I'm really grateful for those conversations, but I think they're really, really hard for people to have, and they're uncomfortable, but they're so necessary if we really want to desegregate, which is I think the crux of some of your questions, Vivian, are, these policies that created segregation, how do we unwind those? How do we unravel those? And I think there's a lot of work that goes on underneath that. And it's these kinds of conversations that you're hosting here, and the kinds of conversations that have been hosted over the course of, the last several months, and in fact, even a little bit longer.
Thank you, Representative Gouveia. Representative Sena, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, it's always it's like, yes, I support public housing, but not in my backyard, right?
Yeah.
Usually that common
Right.
sense. So it's, so you know, it's frustrating at moments because change comes very slow, right? And as we do things, it just happens very slowly. And sometimes we make progress and it comes backwards in whatever issue that we're discussing. And one example is like kind of the colonial here, how you know, now we have kind of some division going on. But it's really, you know, looking at the whole state, I mean, we have a housing crisis. And it's just getting worse. And I feel one way to address the housing crisis is to be able to actually have, it's a supply and demand. If we have more housing, then there's probably, most likely the prices eventually will go down. But the way the population is increasing, and then if we're not focusing some of those resources in building more houses, then the problem is going to get worse. And we need to really find ways, creative ways to build more, not only affordable housing, just housing in general. And you know, there's some rules in certain towns, right? You can't go to a second or third floor, right? We want to maintain that, and I think that's a dialogue we start to having. Should we start building higher buildings and so on and so forth? So those are discussions we ought to start having. And I know, you know, Acton is a small town, but if you look at it, there really isn't that much land. It's really being well developed in certain areas. And how can we balance the need for more housing and at the same time make people in town, you know, happy with the town? So it's a dialogue, and there's a balance. And what can we do? But I certainly want to see more housing built, not only in my district but across Massachusetts, because we need to make it more affordable for everyone. And right now, it's just getting worse.
Yeah, thank you all for that. I mean, when we talk of housing, I know you said, you know, the Africans who live here are, you know, are not necessarily low and middle income families. But I think one of the conversations has been that we need more Black people. Some of us who are living here are still struggling to stay here. We're like, okay, where's the exit out of here? Because we can't afford to live here because we don't have high incomes. So this is just it ties me to the next need. I know we've talked a lot about housing, but transportation, affordable free transportation for people who do not have 2 or 3 cars in the household, but need to get to places. Is there any legislation that can help?
Yeah, there certainly is. There's I think the transportation piece is so key, because the reality is that if we don't make it easier to access, you know, sort of every part of Massachusetts, especially in Eastern Mass, where there's just a real strong job growth, then it's going to be harder for those that are less well off to get to, you know, places where more jobs are being created. You know, I'm proud that we have the commuter rail. The reality is that, you know, overwhelmingly benefits, you know, middle and upper middle class, you know, residents, because the transportation is so expensive to pay to commute into Boston or Cambridge. So, you know, as far as legislation, I mean, I do think we need to continue to have a dialogue around progressive taxation to raise revenue. And it's not just improving commuter rail and making it less expensive, or dare I say free, is improving, you know, shuttle systems, which, you know, Acton has done better than most other towns, but, you know, I think we need to do more. And that's really about state funding and federal funding. You know, the western part of my district also overlaps with Representative Sena's. You know, we have Devon's, where there's an incredible number of jobs being created for sort of all sorts of education levels and professions. But the barrier is it's still quite hard to get there. And that might not be improved commuter rail. It might be better shuttle systems, or, you know, other ways to get people to where the jobs are being created. So it's a multi-pronged effort, but at the end of the day, we need to raise the revenue to create transportation equity, which does not exist in Massachusetts now.
Well, do you want to add anything to that, Representative Gouveia? Or
yeah, really quickly. So the thing I would add is it's about the cost, but it's also time, and the fact that the commuter rail and a lot of the transportation systems that do exist in suburban communities, but even in urban communities, are not always reliable and convenient. They oftentimes, don't match up. So you might have a shuttle bus that can take you to the commuter rail, but then you're waiting half an hour before the commuter rail comes. And if you're a parent, or if you're, working full time and you're a student in the evenings, it's really challenging to make public transportation always work with your schedule and what your family needs are. And so we're oftentimes making the choice to get in our cars and drive, an hour and a half to get into Boston, rather than being able to take the commuter rail. And cost is definitely a factor. But I think when you have cost plus lack of convenience, plus it's not really reliable, I think it's really an issue. And I'm sure Rep. Sena has more to add, because I've seen him on the commuter rail platform, and he has a young family. My kids are older, so it's a little bit easier for me. But I think about, constituents and residents in the area who do have young children who have to get back maybe because of daycare, or but in the before times, dance class, or, softball, or whatever it might be that our kid, to support our kids' growth in terms of their activities. But it's really hard to make that work. So I don't know what your thoughts are on that, Rep. Sena, but I just think about you a lot when I used to see you on the train platform and all that you had to juggle when it comes to transportation and your family.
Thank you, Representative Gouveia. You reminded me one day I had to pick up Juliana, and the kinder care used to close around 6 o'clock, and I was on my way back from Boston, and like, if this train breaks, I have to call the school because it was not a reliable transportation, and I think in that week there was some problems with the train, and I'm like already worried about the impact that could have happened. Not only just to me, but everybody else that was in that train. So we certainly, I would like to see the day that public transportation is actually free, because it really should be free. That's how I think about it. If public transportation, it's public, run by the government, would like to see it free. But what can we do to improve it? I mean, there was a way for you to complain back in the days with the MBTA. If the train was not on time, you could get your money back. Right, and nowadays you can't. You can no longer complain about it. It looks like they removed that ability. So instead of getting better, it's actually getting worse when it comes to the consumer rights. Right. I mean, you're expecting the train to arrive at 3 o'clock, and it comes at 3:30 or 4 o'clock. You should have the right to get your money back. And I think it's that we need to make sure that the consumers' rights are being protected, and we need to invest in public transportation. I would like to see it. Maybe by the time I retired, I don't know. I certainly would like to see it free.
It was important for me for us to talk about transportation, because there is an understanding that when we solve some of these problems, the structural infrastructure, then we help Black lives. Because oftentimes, again, because they have low incomes, then they can get transportation to places with jobs, like you mentioned, and which takes me into the next segment, which is the last one, about the history of Blacks in Acton. What is this? So the town of Acton has diversified over years, but the percentage of Blacks living here is still small. However, Acton has an untold history of Blacks. What is that history?
I think Senator Eldridge.
Wow. Okay. We're gonna be like that. Okay. Well, I will say the person actually who's really highlighted it for me, to her credit, is our one of our school committee members, Kira Wilson Cook, who has written a few articles about the history of Black residents in Acton, making the point that it's not a new thing per se. So I believe that there were a number of sort of small groups or neighborhoods, because obviously I'm sure there was major restrictions on where any Black person could live, but of freed slaves, of free Black men and women and families that lived in Acton. So I know that there were those populations, but to your point, Vivian, it still is is rather small. I really have just seen in the past 10 years an increase of Black residents, including large percentage of both African immigrants and Caribbean immigrants. And I think that's just recent. And I really don't think you're going to see much of a change until, which Representative Gouveia has talked about is, how does Acton become more of a welcoming place? And I'll just give you one example is I was speaking to a Black constituent of mine last night who recently moved to Acton, and she generally likes living in the town, but she did say when she went across the street to the grocery store that she really just felt whether from employees or just people in general in that grocery store, she just got a lot of looks. She just didn't feel welcomed. And so that's a very difficult thing to change, but unless we change that to make sure everyone is feeling welcome, I don't think you're going to see much of an increase of the Black community, or any community in Acton outside of the white community. So,
Representative Gouveia, do you want to add anything, or
Yeah, I mean, I think Senator Eldridge really covered it. The only thing I would add is that, there were very prominent families who also lived here, and they lived in surrounding communities. And so I think that is important for us to acknowledge. And over time, as happens with a lot of things, there has been a desire from particularly white people in positions of influence and power over the centuries to sort of make people disappear, make it seem like, that this really is just predominantly or pretty much all white community. And I'm really thrilled that that is changing, because I moved here from Lowell. I moved here from an incredibly diverse community. And I love to see, the ways that our town is celebrating the different cultures who are here and are having these kinds of conversations on an ongoing basis. I think one of the things that's really important for us to do as part of Black History Month is to celebrate Black joy and resilience, and not only focus on the challenges. The challenges are very, very real, and I don't want to ever come across as or dismiss those in any way, shape, or form. But there's also just tremendous joy and reasons to celebrate, and I find that to be really uplifting and exciting.
Which brings me right to the last question. As legislator, in what ways are you harnessing this Black History Month to make an impact in the lives of Black people in your constituencies? Starting with Senator Jamie and Representative Gouveia, and then Representative Sena, in that order.
Yeah, and first of all, I apologize is that, happy Black History Month, started this Monday. So terrific, really important, celebration. And I think you're seeing more celebrations of it this year, certainly than I've seen in, a very long time. So that's great to see. And as far as, legislation that is being filed, whether by myself or others, I think out of the pandemic, there were a number of racial equity task forces on everything from, COVID relief to healthcare, to, job loss. And so a lot of those committees are putting forward bills or making recommendations around equity. We're seeing it right now around the distribution of the vaccine, where there's some glaring racial inequities about who's getting access to the vaccine and who isn't. As someone that big proponent of making healthcare a right, and I co-chair the Medicare for All caucus with Representative Gouveia, and I know Representative Sena is a big supporter of the bill, is we're filing Medicare for All, making healthcare right. There's so many healthcare inequities against people of color, largely because of the access barriers, but also how people of different backgrounds are treated by our medical profession. So, if we can't at least make healthcare right and sort of eliminate those access barriers, we're never going to address those racial disparities. And then I think that there's so many bills, but I will say a continued focus on criminal justice reform, I serve as the Senate chair of the Criminal Justice Reform Caucus. We're going to be looking at everything from repealing mandatory minimums to improving prison conditions to justice reinvestment, shifting money away from mass incarceration to actually helping where communities have been most impacted by mass incarceration, the war on drugs, which tends to be poor communities, working class communities, and communities of color. That's the only way we're going to address the racial disparities in Massachusetts, which are in terms of wealth, are among the greatest in the nation. And that's disgraceful. And so we need to attack it from multiple levels. And this kind of, these shows and these educational efforts in Black History Month are critical to moving forward these agendas. So I really commend you for having us on and asking these great questions.
Thank you, Senator Eldridge. Representative Gouveia?
Yeah, there's a couple of things that I worked on last session and that I'll continue to work on this session. But, one bill that some of our colleagues in the legislature worked on that we just voted on again and sent back to the governor was the next generation climate legislation. And that included environmental justice, really strong environmental justice component, which I think is, really critical to creating greater equity around the environment and climate change. We know that communities of color and low-income communities, which are not always synonymous, but that those are the communities that are impacted the most by climate change. And so really happy to see that that's part of this particular piece of legislation. So we did send that back to the governor and we'll see what happens. We do have a veto-proof majority, but we'll see what components of that bill he might want to try to strike out. In terms of work that I've done, so I've been partnering with Representative Liz Miranda. She represents Dorchester area and on an adverse childhood and community experiences bill. So trying to get a real handle on trauma that our communities and people of color experience in particular as it relates to the housing crisis, employment crisis, education crisis, and all of the impacts on, that we're witnessing and seeing as it relates to COVID response. And so we've been working on that bill, and that will be filed again in this session just to really shine a spotlight on not only the trauma side, but the resilience side of people and also access to therapy treatment. The other things, Senator Eldridge talked about incarceration and, criminal justice reform. I'm looking at a bill that I'll file as it relates to drug policies that we know have disproportionately impacted Black men in particular. And then picking up something slightly different, which is looking at disinformation campaigns and the fact that women of color in particular, but also men of color are attacked online more often, particularly if they're in positions of influence like elected officials. We know that, even down in Georgia, people were doxxed who were just poll workers. They were volunteers. So we know that the disinformation campaigns in cybersecurity is really, really important when you think about diversifying our representation in government. So it's something that's really important for us to really be taking a look at and addressing. And so I'll be, doing some work around that. And then later in this month, I am doing a Facebook Live with an expert on mental health in the Black community. And so I'll be pushing that out to folks, just how we can support our Black neighbors and loved ones, because there are multiple layers of threats that are happening among members in the Black community when you think about COVID, systemic racism, and the lack of policies to support wealth generation. So those are some of the things that I've been taking a look at and look forward to working on throughout the session.
Well, thank you, Representative Sena.
Thank you so much, Vivian, for the opportunity. I think for us to be here on the ActonTV. I think it's probably my first time on ActonTV, so thank you. I wanted to say that every week we meet with the Black and Latino caucus, and we share so much in common, because those are issues that we are facing, not only in our own life, but we understand what the impact is on immigrants and people of color. One of the bills that I'm so happy to file this time is the universal pre-K. We have a lot of bureaucracy when it comes to a voucher system with the early childhood and care department or agency. And one of the bills that I'm filing is to really target children from 3 to 5 to be able to go to a child care, extended from 12 to from K to 12. So basically, we're trying to make it easier for people who are low income or people who are also middle class Americans to be able to afford childcare and not be burdened by it. Another bill that I'm working on is providing free Wi-Fi or free internet for someone if they reside in a public housing. So those are some of the things that we can do to direct impact, low-income families. But I want to let everyone know that the interest for my constituents, I will be addressing them every single day at the State House. And in the Black and Latino Caucus, we discuss things and we discuss ways that we can be proactive in how we can actually accomplish legislation such as the Safe Community Act, the Working Family Mobility Act. Those are also legislation that that is within our maybe 20 priority legislation that we want to see it pass. Also, there's another bill that Carlos Gonzalez, he was the chair of the Black and Latino Caucus last session, and one of the bills that he filed that I'm actually looking into it is people who were wrongfully accused of a crime, or kind of looking at ways that we can improve that. So with that, I just want to say thank you and happy Black History Month. Is that?
So I want to say thank you to all of you for making time to come and have this conversation on Black History Month. Thank you for the work you do in your constituencies. We see it, we like it, and we say thank you. To our viewers, if you want to be a guest on Acton in Focus, or if you have a story about anything happening in Acton, just email us at infocus@actontv.org. Again, it's infocus@actontv.org. Thank you for watching Acton in Focus. Till next time.